Imagine being invited somewhere, not to be honored, but to be humiliated. The sterling was a grammar of wealth, marble that kept its cool under 1,000 palms, chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, and mirrors that bent the light just enough to flatter the already certain. Waiters moved through the dining room in uniforms pressed to the point of ceremony, balancing flutes of champagne and plates that gleamed under the chandelier's bloom. It smelled of lemon oil, expensive perfume, and the faint, habitual steam of a kitchen that never slept. At the center of that gloss sat James Whitmore, whose name was on glass towers and whose smile could broker entire industries. Beside him, Victoria Ashford arranged her laugh like a piece of jewelry. Maya Thompson moved through the sterling as if she belonged to its furniture, present, necessary, unseen. She had been there long enough to know the quiet geography of the place, which table always asked for extra bread, which patron preferred their steak rare enough to be mistaken for a new idea. Her hands were the hands of someone who had filled other people's lives with care, small laces of healed cuts across knuckles, a faint pale crescent on the palm from an old burn. At 45, she carried herself in a way that never announced the way the world tried to make her small. She learned to fold dignity into plain movements. That evening, the room shivered on the edge of a celebration. An engagement dinner, the kind that made servers sharper and guests lighter, all the right eyes trained on the couple. Guests toasted ambitions into their champagne glasses. Waitstaff synchronized their steps. The sterling's maitre d' attended to each arrival like a conductor preparing an orchestra to perform for itself. Victoria had brought a small object, an ornament of cruelty disguised in gloss. A cream envelope, hand-sealed with a wax stamp, addressed in looping script. She tapped it against her nail as if it were a talisman. The gesture was private and public at once, a punctuation that invited attention. She waited until the clink of her fork stopped the small talk at the table, and then, with a smile that never reached her eyes, caught Maya's line of movement. "Come here," Victoria called. The word was simple. The tone complicated it. A cue for others to watch. Heads turned like sunflower faces. Laughter, the kind that gathers inertia and makes everyone complicit, rippled through the company. Victoria's friends repositioned themselves to get a better angle. This was, they believed, entertainment. Maya walked the fine line of professional composure. Her tray sat steady in her hands. She approached with the practiced ease of someone who had learned not to let the room see what burned inside. A server's face is trained to be invisible. Customers are to be seen, served, admired. The irony lived in the muscles of that profession. Visibility for everyone else. Invisibility for the one who ensured the light. Victoria slid the envelope across the table, her fingers delicate on the cream paper. "We thought it would be funny," she said, pitched so the remark could be overheard and enjoyed by those at the table. "Invite a real waitress to join our little celebration. Let her see how the other half lives." There was pause, an intake of breath from the room that smoothed into applause like a perfumed wave. Someone laughed, sharp and delighted. There are manners for the wealthy. There are rituals for humiliating a person without leaving a bruise. Victoria's act fit one of those rituals, a public performance that required an audience. Maya looked at the envelope. She looked at the faces around the table. Her throat tightened, not with surprise, not with indignation that played loud in other people's imaginations, but with that older, quieter grief that had lived under the ribs for years. She could have walked away. She could have refused, made a scene, or become the spectacle they wanted. Instead, she took the envelope in both hands. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. A sentence so small it could be mistaken for courtesy. But there was a refusal in the flatness of her voice. It was not the startled apology they expected, nor the sobbing collapse of some dramatized indignity. It was a collected exchange, an acknowledgement of the object, and the refusal to perform the role they had written for her. The room tittered, puzzled for an instant by the wrong response, then resumed its laughter. People loved humiliation when it looked like a show. Discomfort dissolves when the play continues as before. Maya turned away and continued her route. Her back was a map of a life that never allowed itself the luxury of dramatic exits. After service, when the sterling settled into its night rhythm and the last flutes emptied, Maya took the bus back to a small apartment that smelled like the safe things she kept. Old books, lemon-scented cleaner, and the faint echo of a life lived on someone else's timetable. Her slippers had long since given up being pretty. The hallway light flickered at the landing like a thoughtful but unreliable guardian. Inside, everything insisted on thrift. Mismatched cups, a table with a wobble, a small plant that survived because Maya watered it even when she had nothing left to give. A locked metal box sat on the top shelf of her closet, tucked behind a stack of sweaters. It had lived there for 15 years, patient as a secret. Tonight the cream envelope tapped against the hollow of her chest, and the box answered. She reached for it without thinking, fingers remembering the metal's cold. The box held pieces of a life that had been folded and labeled by others, a bundle of letters in her father's handwriting, a few medical files that had been photocopied and kept in a manila folder, and a single photograph faded at the edges. She had carried that box for so long it had become both armor and accusation. When she was younger, she would run her fingers along the edge of the photograph, feeling the hollowness of the life that had been lost to rumor and pain. She opened a letter first, careful with the paper as if it were some living thing. Her father's handwriting leaned to the right, impatient and warm. The lines spoke of ordinary things, repairing the roof, the way the light tilted in the late afternoons, and then, as if dropping the act of small talk into something more intimate, a sentence about his heart. The words were not technical, they were human and earnest. A quiet fear, an acceptance, a plea not to let blame live when the truth was only that the heart, stubborn and flawed, had failed. There were medical notes, not an inventory, but records that named a condition, a thickened heart muscle that had been the unseen weight under his breathing. The diagnosis matched what the letters implied, a clinical confirmation of what he had tried to explain in his softer way. There was no hint of foul play, no evidence that someone had turned a slow illness into something sinister. Just a small, steady fact. A heart, weakened in a particular way. For 15 years, when grief was raw and the noise of accusation was easier than the complexity of sorrow, Maya had accepted a simpler story. It was handed to her like a weapon, that Catherine had been responsible, that an argument had turned fatal. It was easier to hate than to sit with the jagged, dissonant truth that people leave without enemies being created to explain their absence. The rumor had built a wall between daughter and mother, and Maya had climbed it brick by brick, each brick a hurt, each mortar a choice to believe the louder tale. As she read, the room emptied of its breath. The letters filled the hush with a voice she had almost forgotten. His inflections, his small jokes tucked into the margins, the way he always ended with an admonition to keep the plant alive. She allowed herself the failure of weeping, not melodramatic, but a release that unknotted some of the pressure she'd been holding for years. The grief she had disguised as rage loosened into something more honest. Regret for time lost. Sorrow for a man she had loved and believed she'd lost to a story. The cream envelope slid from her hand on the kitchen table and left a faint smear of flour where she'd been rolling dough earlier that day. She folded the father's letters again with care and laid them back in the metal box, but this time she did not shut it with the same mechanical finality. Instead, she paged through the rest of the papers, old bills, a photocopied death certificate, a medical summary, and an old voice from a conversation she hadn't had in 15 years rose up like a chorus. Catherine's last letter to her, written when everything fractured, full of explanations that never landed because both of them were sprinting away from a pain they didn't know how to sit with. At the core of the box was a note in Catherine's handwriting, folded twice. The edges softened. The letter was short and measured, without the heightened rhetoric of someone who would attempt to defend themselves. But it had what Maya needed more than pleading, facts and a willingness to be seen. Catherine spoke of the hospital nights, of a son tethered to machines and then silence, of doctors with gentle, terrible words. She did not ask for absolution. She asked for conversation, for the return of a daughter she had raised with certainty and imperfection. For the first time since the funeral, someone else's words made sense of his death, without turning it into an accusation. The letters and the records were not proof of the life she had been denied. They were the beginning of an explanation. Maya's hands trembled with a decision that had been forming quietly beneath the surface for years. She could stay behind the wall she'd built, feeding off the comfortable bitterness that had kept her warm in the nights. Or she could pick up the phone. She dialed. The ring went out into an ocean of white noise. Her thumb hovered, then pressed again. It felt obscene, intimate, like a confession made in public. When Catherine answered, her voice came through the receiver in a way that made the years fold. Neither theatrical nor defensive, simply the voice of a woman worn by consequence and still standing. "Maya," Catherine said. There was a tremor like old weather in the sound, but no accusation. "Mama," Maya replied. The word felt foreign and right at once. It had once been an automatic song on her lips. Now it required clearing the throat of all the years it had to travel. "It's me." Silence, then a breath that Catherine used like a small prayer against the distance. "You have no idea how often I thought of you," Maya swallowed. The urge to launch into the whole history, a 15-year monologue of grievances, rose up like a tide. But the letters were still fresh in her head, a raw mapping of truth she had not yet finished turning into courage. She had learned over the years that conversations that tried to catch up on years often failed, so she chose a smaller truth to begin with, the one that had dissolved her tonight. "Did you know about his heart?" There was a pause, the kind that is a bridge between two people who have not learned the contours of one another recently. "Yes," Catherine said finally. "I tried to tell you. I wrote. I came to the house. Maya heard the cascade of things unsaid. Apologies, failed explanations, the ache of presence missed. "I didn't listen," Maya said. Not an excuse, but an admission. There was a small, almost laugh-like sound from the other end of the line. "We both didn't listen," Catherine said. "And for that, I'm sorry. Whatever else, I should have been there. I should have stayed." Things unspooled like that. Slow, deliberate. Each admission coaxing the other into place. They were not tearing back old wounds like theatrical surgeons. They were tending to them, gently, with the awkwardness of people who didn't know the tools they had used years ago to build walls. "Maya," Catherine said at one point, and her voice sharpened with the thing that had matured in absence. Responsibility without grand promises. "If you will let me, I want to come see you. I want to come home." The words were small and enormous at once. "I don't know what that'll look like," Maya said. "I don't know if I can just pretend." "You don't have to pretend," Catherine replied. "Come as you are. Let me see you as you are." That line, so simple and honest, broke something open in Maya. It was not a demand for reconciliation on Catherine's terms. It was an invitation without stage directions. She felt a strange, awkward blossoming inside her chest. Hope, or perhaps the first clean air after breathing stale stories for years. "Okay," Maya said. The syllable felt like a hinge being oiled. "Okay, come." The bus ride to the Sterling had been the kind of commute that taught you how much of life could be recited by rote. The same street vendors, the same crack in the pavement by the corner florist, the same woman who always waved at the passing bus as if it were a relative. The city listened to you because you lived inside its hum, but the city also held its grander illusions, that wealth could organize itself in towers and awards, that the wealthy could stage moments of power without ever acknowledging the human beings whose hands made the occasion possible. When Maya hung up the phone, she did so with the sensation of a different kind of weight in her hands. The box on the shelf felt less like a confession and more like a map. She laid the letters carefully back inside, closed the lid, and then sat on the edge of her bed, the late-night city noise a distant, comforting murmur. For the first time in years, she let herself think about the possibility of an explanation offered and an explanation received. It did not erase the past. It simply opened a door that had been nailed shut. In the days that followed, the small routines shifted in subtle ways. Maya went to work with the same steadiness, but there was a new softness in the set of her shoulders. She moved through the Sterling, unseen, but now unseen with intention rather than invisibility born of habit. Her coworkers noticed tiny changes. A new patience at the end of a long shift, fewer small jokes about herself, a pause that suggested she was listening for something larger. Victoria, for her part, returned to her social orbit with the same radiant ease, Her laughter continued to be a polished thing, designed to draw attention and admiration. James, as usual, floated at her side like the shadow of success. He noticed the incidents of the staff only insofar as they reflected upon the room he curated. Their world was efficient and closed. It required only that its performance never falter. Maya kept the cream envelope in her bag as if to test the way reality could still fold into old shapes. Sometimes she would take it out in the quiet of the Sterling's prep area and smooth the paper between her fingers. At night, after the bus hummed and the apartment light went low, she would open the box and touch the edges of letters that smelled faintly of his aftershave. A memory so specific, it felt like a physical place. Word moved quietly through the Sterling that James Whitmore's engagement would have a private celebratory dinner. Those were the petites fêtes that made servers adjust their posture, the kind of evening where a person in the room could be put on display without consent and the crowd would call it charm. Maya knew those rituals intimately. She also knew the pattern of cruel amusements. A wealthy person uses their power to create a moment that elevates them and diminishes someone else. The instruments were small, a tap of a nail, an envelope slid across a table, but the design was obvious. On the night Victoria chose for her performance, Maya found herself on the route that placed her near the engagement table more than once. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned their station. When Victoria lifted the cream envelope like a prop, it made everyone lean forward. When she invited Maya to accept it in front of the table, the move folded the room into complicity. The joke landed how Victoria expected, like a coin dropping into an audience's palms. Laughter, the glitter of eyes, the approving nods. But Maya's thank you had unsettled the script. The wrongness of it, that she had refused to be small in the way they asked, registered for a second like a slippage in a well-rehearsed play. A few people at the table exchanged looks, less cruel than curious, and then the rhythm resumed. The show went on. People clinked glasses. The Sterling continued to be a cathedral of illusion. Back at her apartment that night, she opened the locked box again. Her father's letters felt like a bridge to a boy's laugh, to a man who had loved with a frankness she'd known in small doses as a child. She reread the line where he had written about being tired and asking for a cup of tea. Tears came and went like small tides. She thought of Catherine's voice on the phone, steady and somewhat chastened, and thought about how long it had been since anyone had asked to come. The decision to call had not been made in a single dramatic second. It had congealed over days, fed by the realities of paper and ink. Yet once the call had been made, and the word "come" had left Catherine's mouth, there was no going back to the shape of life before. The only choice was how to meet what would come next. She found herself standing in front of the mirror in her cramped bathroom and studying the lines at the corner of her eyes. They were not flaws, but stories. Late nights, laughter, survival. She brushed her fingers against the faint scar on her hand and remembered carrying him alone out of an apartment room that smelled like antiseptic and hot summer. She remembered the rumors that followed, the looks that turned away when people didn't have the courage to ask the truth. She remembered the way her mother had held herself, not as an absence but as a presence that had felt, to everyone else, almost too big. When Catherine arrived at her building 2 days later, she stood in the foyer like someone who had traveled with purpose. There was a certain dignity about her, a presence that didn't need to perform. Her coat closed in a practical line, her hair was pulled back. She carried a small bag, like someone bringing news rather than baggage. Maya had not seen her in 15 years. Those intervening years had slotted into a long, echoing space. Standing now, Catherine looked older, but the face was the one Maya remembered. Eyes that had the same tendency to crinkle when she laughed, a mouth that had always been quick to form a smile when relief arrived. When the door to Maya's apartment opened, the air smelled like lemon and the faint must of old books. Catherine stepped inside, and for a moment both of them stood in the middle of the small room, measuring the distance the years had made. They did not collapse into a cinematic embrace. Instead, there was a careful approach. A hand lifted, hovering with the gentleness of someone used to fears, then a clean, unmistakable contact. They held each other, not as a drama of reconciliation, but as two people acknowledging the shape of their own failures and the beginning of a repair. Maya, Catherine said, the name a blessing and a small apology all in one. Mama, Maya replied. The word slid into place without theatrics. There was a long exhale between them, the kind that carries away a part of the burden. I brought something, Catherine said quietly. From the bag she produced nothing ostentatious, a small bundle of calming tea, a folded note, and a photograph of Maya, as a child, in a small backyard, her father's arm thrown casually around them both. It was the kind of thing that does not prove anything to strangers, but proves everything to someone who remembers the particular curve of morning light on a living room floor. They sat at the wobbly table and talked in fragments at first, the conversation an awkward spool of apologies and questions. Neither had the story perfected. Both shared the clumsy grammar of people trying to translate long distance into closeness. Catherine's voice stayed steady and unadorned. She spoke of the hospital stays with an economy that suggested the facts were hard enough without embellishment. Maya listened with a fierce attention that had more humility than anger now. There was, suddenly, a hunger for the ordinary truth rather than the dramatic fiction that had made easy villains. At one point, Catherine reached into her bag and produced a photocopy of a medical summary. She did not brandish it like evidence. She handed it over the table like a small offering. I kept this, she said, because I thought perhaps someday you might want to see it. Maya ran a finger over the photocopied lines. The words matched the contours of what the box had suggested. A clinical description of a heart conformation that can make life fragile, a diagnosis that admitted no conspiracy, only a stubborn biology. Seeing it with Catherine's hand near it, not as an accusation but as a companion to the letters, rewired something inside Maya. It was not vindication in the loud way the rumor mongers would have wanted. It was a gentle, devastating clearing of the air. There were moments of embarrassed laughter, as when they both recalled trivialities of past holidays. There were silences that felt like the soft work of stitching. And then, without theatrical command, a plan began to form on a more practical level. Catherine was not interested in a grand public apology as spectacle. She was interested in being present, and in the practical steps of reknitting family threads. Paying for repairs Maya hadn't been able to afford, arranging for a doctor to check on things that needed checking, and, with a certainty that surprised Maya, an offer to help produce a platform for the truth to be acknowledged without fanfare. We don't need a performance, Catherine said, sincere in her refusal of spectacle. I don't want to rescue you, Maya. I want you to come as yourself. If you ever want something different, help, a job, a chance, I'll hold that door open. But it's your choice. Maya looked at her mother. The offer did not straighten her spine by itself, but it did open the possibility of a different life. She felt suddenly the small shame of someone who had been surviving on the sustenance certain stories provide. She did not accept the offer as a concession to wealth. She accepted it as a chance to stop living by rumor. Thank you, she said. It was both an echo of the earlier thank you at the Sterling and a new kind of gratitude. That night, after Catherine left, Maya lay awake thinking about the Sterling's glitter and Victoria's cream envelope. The envelope had been careless, cruel by design. It had been intended to reduce someone to fun. But what it had actually done, what Maya had allowed it to do, quietly and without spectacle, was prod a sealed box she'd carried for years. It had shown her that sometimes the instruments of humiliation can, if we choose it, be the keys to reclaiming ourselves. She did not sleep much. Her mind pulled at scenes like threads. Victoria's laugh, Catherine's steady apology, letters that smelled faintly of old ink. There was fear, yes. Fear of what it meant to open doors she had kept closed. But there was also a steadier thing. The sense that for the first time in a long while, she could speak the truth out loud. In the morning she caught a reflection of herself in the Sterling's polished brass at the entrance. The woman who looked back had the lines of a life lived fully enough to have acquired the map of hurts. But in her eyes something had shifted. A quietness that wasn't submission, and not a preamble to revenge either. It was a resolve that she had not felt in years, a willingness to show up in the world as she was. That evening Catherine called again. There's to be a small engagement dinner at La Tau Noir, she said. Her voice had the practical cadence of someone who had considered the pros and cons. "It's private. I thought I might come with you. I don't want to turn it into anything, but I think there's value in attending it not as a spectacle, but as an acknowledgement." Maya listened. She could imagine the room. La Tau Noir was the kind of exclusive place that cultivated atmosphere, with a curated playlist and a palette of dark wood and hush. The Sterling had been loud in its polish. La Tau Noir was hushed in its intention. It would be intimate, craning toward the kind of reveal Victoria had hoped would be a performance. "I don't want anyone to feel like we're putting on something for show," Catherine added. "If we go as we are. No revenge, no statements for the cameras." Maya considered the offer. She thought of the sterile, practiced cruelty in Victoria's hand, as the envelope had been offered like a toy. She thought of the letters, their steady human truths. She thought, too, of the strange and delicate pleasure of taking back a narrative. "Okay," she said. The syllable felt small and honest. "I'll go." "Good," Catherine said. "I'll come by tomorrow. We'll go quietly. We'll be you." They agreed on a time. There was something novel in making a plan where both women were honest about why they were there. It was not revenge, it was presence. The next day the Sterling moved as it always did, a machine that produced and consumed private dramas. Victoria posted a photograph on a social feed, the kind that would be curated for praise, herself in lipstick, James with a rolled sleeve, and a caption that braided intimacy with aspiration. Comments arrived like small offerings, congratulations, emojis, the economy of approval that lubricated people like Victoria in the world. The post was a signal. The engagement would be discussed and admired, in the way the wealthy are discussed and admired, in the glow of a stage set to flatter them. Maya walked through the Sterling with the weight of a decision that had been made and the relief of a door opened. She reached for her tray, checked the alignment of plates, and moved. A colleague, a young server who had worked there for 6 months, gave her a look across the prep area, a wink like a lighthouse beacon. The knowledge of the coming night had already started in the understory of the staff. There was curiosity, a muted hope for some recalibration of the room's assumptions. That afternoon, Victoria practiced a smile in a half-lit dressing room, rehearsing lines of small charm for the evening. She had, in truth, not considered the possibility that the envelope might trigger anything beyond a moment of private entertainment. She had not expected the throat-clamping quiet that 2 words, "thank you," could create, but it was not in her nature to be undone by small misfires. She preferred to reassert the script, not rewrite it. Maya came home that evening and found a small bouquet on her table, not the extravagant kind given to a bride-to-be, but simple, tender flowers from Catherine, daisies, a sprig of rosemary. There was a note attached, "Come as you are." The sentence was not a command, but a covenant. She folded the note into her pocket and mimed for a moment the possibilities of clothes she'd never buy, something that fit her without disguising her, without apologizing. For 15 years she had worn invisibility like an undercoat. Now the undercoat felt heavy. She thought of the cream envelope. She thought of her father's handwriting. She thought of a mother who had not demanded showy apologies, but had brought a photograph instead. When Catherine arrived the next afternoon, she stood at the doorstep with a practical air. A stylist was not present. No entourage. An absence of spectacle. She had come as she said she would come, unadorned and purposeful. They moved through the small rituals of preparing, a quick hair arrangement, an exchange about what to wear, a practical solution for shoes that didn't murder the feet in the first hour. The preparations were not a makeover so much as an affirmation, a decision to present oneself without apology. There was no fanfare, there was no attempt to turn the evening into theater, and that made the plan dangerous to the sort of people who thought power was only public performance, because it removed the props and left only 2 people standing with truth and intention. At the door of La Tau Noir, the night's air felt slightly cooler, as if the city itself had drawn a breath. The exterior of the place was dark and curated, a velvet awning, 2 discreetly positioned valets, and the sound muffled in the way exclusive rooms like to be muffled. Inside, the space was intimate, low-lit, Wood and soft leather embraced the tables. Guests spoke in lowered tones. The staff moved like shadowed geometry, trained to erase themselves in the theater of luxury. Maya smoothed the fabric of her dress and felt for the first time in a long time that her own presence was not a debt to be paid. She moved into the room beside Catherine, and the pair crossed the threshold like two people who understood the difference between being seen and being performed. People looked up. Eyes measured, catalogued, and rearranged themselves to accommodate the unexpected sight of a woman who, until tonight, had been the invisible hand behind many evenings' comforts, standing in simple dignity beside the woman who had once been rumored to have been the cause of a family's fracture. The room itself paused in a way that felt like a held breath. There was a table near the center where Victoria and James sat, surrounded by a small constellation of approval. Victoria's posture shifted when she saw them. The smile that had been practiced for the cameras didn't falter. Rather, it tightened into a more dangerous thing, an attempt to reclaim control. She bent forward slightly as if to include them in a private moment, and then, seeing Catherine, tightened the frame of her expression into something like curiosity. Maya and Catherine took a seat at a table against the wall to begin, choosing calm instead of confrontation. The room buzzed with the delicate symphony of cutlery on small plates, the whisper of conversations not meant to be overheard, the discreet clink of glasses. Victoria watched with a measured interest. She had orchestrated an invitation for entertainment once. Seeing the potential of a counter-narrative unsettled a part of her that relied upon predictability. But tonight, she intended to steer the little drama her way, confident that the audience would prefer the spectacle she knew how to produce. She did not yet comprehend that some encounters refused to be folded into a script. At the edge of that contained world, in a corner where servers moved almost invisibly, small currents of observation began to ripple. A woman at a nearby table, Diane Rothschild, a familiar face in certain circles, glanced up, her expression altering like a weather change. There was recognition in her eyes, but the significance of that recognition and what she might do with it would not be immediate. Scenes take time to arrange. Consequences have their own chronology. Inside Maya, something steadied. Being there, present and seen, was not a line on a script she had to hit. It was a work of rediscovery. She listened to Catherine's voice across the small distance and felt its normal cadence. She let herself taste the dinner with the same care she gave to serving others. Small bites, attention to texture, the pleasure of the company without theatrics. The evening moved forward like a careful conversation. Laughter hovered, not the cruel kind, but the kind that comes when people are allowed to be ordinary. The sterling's glitter was absent. Here, nuance mattered. Guests considered one another. Plates were cleared with purposeful grace, but outside the hushed hubbub of La Tau Noir, the cream envelope still existed in the world as a small, scandalous artifact of cruelty. It had been designed to make a person tiny for the amusement of others. Instead, it had opened a box. That paradox was the engine behind the night's quiet tension. Power used for private amusement versus presence that demanded attention without spectacle. As the dinner settled into its rhythm, Maya felt the city continue its movement beyond the restaurant's doors. The same city that had once cradled a rumor and let it ossify into an untruth that had separated her from her family. Now, sitting with Catherine beside her, with the hum of reserved voices around them, she felt the shape of a path that led somewhere she could hardly yet name. She stayed quiet, mostly listening. When she spoke, it was not to issue proclamations, but to offer small truths. An anecdote about a child's laugh in a neighborhood near the Sterling, a memory of her father's terrible jokes. The room did not demand more. It allowed space. And in that space, the action of being present felt like a moral force, more convincing than any staged humiliation could ever be. Someone at a near table joked about trivialities. Someone else returned that joke with a gentle private amendment. The evening flowed. From across the room, Victoria's eyes watched, calculating how to fold the new variable into her comfortable narrative. The door opened for a moment, and a gust of cool night air brushed over the restaurant, like the city's reminder that nothing inside could remain utterly sealed from the world. A shadowed shape lingered in the doorway, taking in the scene, then closed the door quietly. The moment was unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the coordinates of histories, But for Maya, it registered like a drumbeat. Outside forces, small and large, always pressing. She looked over at Catherine and found herself thinking about the strange geometry of power. How it could be visible in the look on someone's face, or invisible in the silence of a medical report. She thought about the ways people reduce others to the roles they are given. Tonight, though, she had the small stubbornness to refuse that reduction. She had chosen to accept an invitation that had been meant to make her small, and turned it into the beginning of something else. When they finally rose to leave, the room returned to its performed warmth. Guests resumed their private constellations. The staff synchronized to the rhythm of clearing plates. Outside, in the cool of the night, the city glittered like 1,000 small declarations. Victoria's laughter could still be heard as they walked past the valet, small and practiced. James's presence a steady part of the architecture of the room. Maya and Catherine stepped into the taxi's yellow light, and the car slid away into the city's veins. For Maya, the night's real movement began only after that. The slow unspooling of what it meant to make herself visible in front of people who had for years rendered her invisible. At home, she placed her father's letters back in the box and closed the lid with less of the old finality. She did not yet know where that decision would take her. There were delicate alignments to be made, conversations to be had. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the ground under her feet shifting in a way that was not frightening but clarifying. It was not an answer to what had been done to her. It was the beginning of a restatement of who she would be when the world looked her way. Later, in the quiet between sleep and waking, Maya found herself thinking about the next steps. How would she present herself without becoming another image for consumption? How would she step into spaces where the script had been set by others and insist upon her own lines? She did not. She did not want the world to turn her into a spectacle. She wanted only to step into a room and be a person with a history, not an exhibit of someone else's entertainment. Tell us where you're watching from. The night tightened like a held breath as Maya and Catherine moved through La Tau Noire. They had agreed on no dramatics, but there is a gravity to honesty that lands heavy in quiet rooms. The two of them crossed the threshold and took a place just off the main constellation of tables, not to hide, but to observe how the room would rearrange itself around reality. At first, the evening wore the polite indifference of the very well-bred. Conversation softened when they neared. Glasses were lifted in polite acknowledgement, and servers glided by with plates like sealed letters. Victoria and James occupied their table with the easy confidence of people used to the glow of approval. Victoria's smile had been practiced for years. Tonight, she used it the way one uses a blade that's always been trusted to cut only what is needed. Maya listened. She registered small things. The way a fork was used as punctuation. The half-turned glance that catalogued a dress rather than a person. The particular hush that comes when a joke is being prepared to land. She felt the envelope's weight in her bag like a talisman that had been inverted. It had been intended to belittle. Instead, it now sat as a little anchor reminding her of choices she had already made. Conversation circled, delicate and domestic, until a pause produced a ripple. A glass was set down too quickly, a napkin smoothed with a force that betrayed unease. Diane Rothschild, who had been speaking in the low register of those who live in social orbit, had quieted and looked toward Catherine with an expression that moved from curiosity to recognition. Diane's voice cut the small talk like a clean chisel. It was not the mocking tone of a crowd desperate for scandal. It held instead the particular friction of someone remembering two things at once: a name and an obligation. "Catherine Thompson," she said, loud enough for several at the next table to hear. "Is that really you?" Heads turned. Recognition, when it arrives in rooms built for performance, arrives like a tide that redraws the sand. People who had been comfortable with the idea of entertainment now tilted toward something that suggested consequence. Victoria's practiced smile faltered for the fraction of a moment it takes a clock to catch its breath. She leaned forward slightly, the posture of someone trying to corral an unexpected variable. "Yes," she said, voice edged with the calm of someone used to control. "Catherine is here." Diane's gaze met Catherine's, and there was a small but decisive change in her face, the kind of change that signals moral choice more than social surprise. "I know Catherine," she said. "We worked together on the hospital board years ago. She helped save a lot of projects that mean a lot to a lot of people. The name landed like a pebble in a pond whose surface had been glossed over with complacency. A few people at neighboring tables nodded, some with recognition, others with the curious instinct to align themselves with the side that would be seen as right when the outcome was finally understood. "And you, Victoria," Diane added, looking at her with a directness that gave the room permission to follow. "You invited one of the staff here as if she were your entertainment." The words were not theatrical. They were simple and precise. The crowd's mood tilted. The laughter that had accompanied the envelope earlier that week at the Sterling, the laughter that had been smooth and mutual and light, found itself in the awkward position of being on the wrong side of a moral ledger. Victoria's defenses rose like a quick curtain. "It was meant as a joke," she said, the sentence brittle. "An irony. I didn't—" "You think it's ironic to make someone the entertainment for your table?" Diane cut in. Her voice was not loud, but it had the authority of one who knew the cost of being cavalier with people's dignity. "That's not a joke. That's cruelty." A murmur moved through the room, at first small like a draft, then widening as people exchanged looks and, quietly, moved their chairs back from the performance they had been invited to enjoy. James's face, which had been an architecture of affability, watched these exchanges with the first signs of unease. He had been comfortable arranging rooms to flatter him. He had not expected the room to rearrange in a way that cut him off from the pleasantness he curated. At the center of the table, Victoria's hand tightened on her glass. "You're making a scene," she hissed, the phrase addressed as much to Diane as to the gathering force of the room. The tone implied that the problem was the attention, not the action. "Someone's dignity isn't a toy," Diane replied, calm and persistent. "You invited a real person to be your spectacle. That matters." Murmurs swelled. People shifted in their seats, no longer content to be mere spectators of what had been set up as white laughter. The waitress at the neighboring table, a young woman who had watched Maya's movements all evening, who knew the economy of the room, leaned forward and said softly, "She didn't ask for this." James looked at Maya then, as if for the first time seeing the person who had been part of his evening but not part of his narrative. There was a pause, an opening in which he could have steered things with a practiced remark. Instead, the pause lengthened into something painful and honest. He removed his hand from the table and looked down at the ring on his finger, at the symbol he apparently wore as both comfort and currency. "Victoria," he said, voice low and the first to carry real direction, "we need to talk." It was not the same as yelling an order. It bore instead the quiet of someone who had recognized his place in a mistake. Victoria's lips pressed together. She looked toward him with an expression that had practiced vulnerability ready to deploy, but he did not accept the cue. He stood, slowly, the action small but decisive. The table went quiet in the way a room does when it waits to see which of its constructed certainties will fall. "This," James said, looking at Victoria, and then to a small assembly of onlookers, "is not why I asked someone to spend their life beside me." He slid his hand under the table, fingers finding the ring. He took it off, rolled it between his fingers, as if measuring its weight for the first time. "I can't do this," he said simply. "I can't be part of this." No one at the table leapt to reshape the moment into a rescue for Victoria. There would be no trite public statement, no last-minute charm. The act of removing a ring in a room like that is an intimate legalism of its own. It states a change in alignment without fanfare. Victoria's face registered shock, and then a swift personal anger that had nothing to do with the room's moral judgment and everything to do with a private wound. "You can't," she began. James shook his head. "No," he interrupted. "I won't stand for it. I won't be the kind of man who allows someone to be humiliated for applause." Then he walked away from the table. He did not make a speech. He did not call for cameras. He left with the quietness of someone who had just reallocated himself. Victoria for a moment sat stunned. The room watched her like a theater waiting for a finish she could not conjure. She pushed herself up and left in a flurry, a small human explosion of dignity collapsing into flight. Her friends followed, some to console, others to collect the ruins of reputation. Conversation resumed in nervous, rearranged clusters, people busying themselves with forks and other rituals, to avoid sitting with the discomfort of seeing a humiliation unravel into consequence. Catherine rose and walked toward the table. She was not theatrical. She did not seek an audience. But when she stood and addressed the cluster of people now forming near Victoria's absence, the tone of her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades learning how to make words do what she meant. "I want to say something about dignity," she began. No one talked over her. "Maya Thompson is a person with a life and a history. She is not here for your amusement. If any of us have forgotten that, then we need to remember it now." Her words were not meant to shame. They were meant to reset the evening's moral compass. People listened. Eyes fell to Maya, who sat very still, hands folded in her lap. She had not risen to the bait. She had not performed indignation. She had chosen the long, disciplined route of presence. "Humiliation," Catherine went on, "is sometimes sold as entertainment. It is not entertainment. It is theft. It steals a person's interior life and sells a caricature in its place." She paused, and the pause was a small thing that made the room breathe. "We can do better." Someone near the back of the room, an editor, a philanthropist, a woman who had been charmed by the earlier spectacle, stood and said quietly, "She's right." The words spread like a soft permission to act rightly. Maya's cheeks were damp with coolness from the air conditioning, not from tears. She felt Catherine's hand at the small of her back, the contact gentle and grounding. For a moment, the two of them simply existed together in the middle of that rearranged moral scene. After a while, as conversation resumed in the tentative way of rooms that have been taught a new lesson, Catherine made a small, practical announcement. "I want to make something clear," she said. "Maya is my daughter. She has her own life and her own agency. I have asked her, and if she will accept, to take a role with Thompson Global Industries. It will not be about trophies or public statements. It is about actual work, giving back, building, and helping the places that mean something to families like ours and families in this city." The words landed as an offer and an opening. They were not grandiose promises of rescue. They were a simple reframing of resources into responsibility. People applauded, a genuine sound that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with approval for what felt like moral realignment. Maya listened. Her chest tightened. This was not a coronation. It was not a ticket out of the life that had taught her dignity in other registers. It was, she thought, a chance to enter a different arena on her own terms. She could feel the weight of the decision. To accept would be to shift her identity publicly. To refuse would be to remain in a room where the terms were set by others. She stood. For the first time in the evening, the room was quiet in the way that comes when a person is given space to speak without interruption. "I appreciate the offer," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud but clear. "I will consider it, but I want to be understood. I am not here to be a symbol. I am not here to heal your guilt or to be proof that apologies can be quick. I am here because I want to do the work. I'm here because I want to stop being the invisible hand and start being a visible person who helps make things better." Her words were not a denial of hurt. They were a refusal to make the evening about anyone's redemption, except those willing to do the work that comes afterwards. The room responded with a hush that felt like the beginning of actual attention. The aftermath of that night did not become a circus. There were no viral tags that turned the event into fodder. Instead, conversations at boards and small gatherings shifted. People spoke privately about the ethics of entertainment and the fine line between charm and cruelty. The Sterling staff, where Maya still worked, watched with a muted curiosity as colleagues and regulars processed the evening. Some offered quiet congratulations. Others offered small looks of vindication as the truth about rumors gave way to the clarity of documents and conversations. Victoria retreated into the kind of social exile that comes when one's performance fails to procure the expected adoration. James's step away from her table was both a personal realignment and a public dissociation, with a form of behavior he no longer wished to sanction. He and Maya spoke later privately, not to make headlines, but to unpack a misunderstanding that had been at the heart of a marriage proposal he could no longer in good faith sustain. Maya took time to consider Catherine's offer. She met with people at Thompson Global, Not the sort of gilded exchange depicted in movies, but practical conversations about programs and teams and the ways a company could actually touch neighborhoods that had been ignored. She insisted on the right to set her terms. She would not be a figurehead. She would accept an operational role with clear responsibilities and accountability. Catherine, who had evolved in the years of their separation, listened and agreed. She trusted Maya's judgment. That trust felt, to Maya, like a new currency. When Maya first walked into Thompson Global's headquarters, she felt the same mix of unease and purpose that had marked her other entrances into new rooms. The place was a mirror of power, glass, measured lines, a staff who moved with a confident economy. But the work she was asked to do had practical edges, organizing community partnerships, designing programs that helped small businesses, and listening to people who had been made small by larger systems. She discovered that the company could be a lever for change if someone with humility and clarity applied the force in the right direction. A few months into her new role, there was an invitation for her to speak in a boardroom assembled for a quarterly meeting. The gathering included a range of people who had been part of Thompson Global's orbit: executives, community leaders, a few of the Sterling's regular patrons who had been gently nudged into conversations about responsibility. Maya was not given a center stage platform. She was offered 5 minutes to explain a pilot program she had led that partnered with neighborhood restaurants and training programs. She stood by a large table, palms flat for steadiness, and addressed the room without theatrics. The speech was short, written by her, and trimmed of anything performative. She had a few notes, but mostly she spoke from a place that had been tested by 15 years of silence and a recent season of re-entry. "When I used to work as a server," she said, "I learned more about human economies than I did about ledgers. I learned how dignity can be delivered across a plate or stolen across a table. I learned that people will often forgive themselves for not seeing, because they are busy being seen. I learned how easy it is to reduce a person to a role, and how hard it is to rebuild them into a citizen." She paused to look around the room. Faces were attentive in a way that suggested true listening, not politeness. "This program," she continued, "is not charity in the old, slow sense. It is accountability. It asks us to change how we think about labor and value. It asks us to treat people as partners, not props. That's what dignity looks like in practice." The boardroom listened as she spelled out the pilot's details with the same practical clarity she brought to every task. Partnerships with culinary schools, mentorship paths, financing options that didn't feel predatory, and advisory roles for people who had been excluded by systems. She named a few numbers in general terms, not as flashy proof, but as responsible accounting of impact. She cited examples of small business owners who had been restored to stability, and young adults who had found a steady job and a sense of pride. When she finished, someone at the end of the room, the young server who had winked at her in the Sterling months before, stood and spoke. "She's not only leading this," he said, "she's showing us how to do it without the need for broadcast." The applause was genuine and not performative. It was recognition for work done, and a social recalibration that had moved from private humiliation to public accountability. Maya's role at the company grew in responsibility because she insisted on results and integrity. There were times when she felt the old humility tug at her, the reflex to shrink when powerful people spoke, but she used those moments as fuel to insist that the spaces she inhabited be exacting and fair. Catherine, watching from the side with a pride she expressed without theatricality, often reminded her daughter, "You are not stepping into shadows to be lit. You are stepping into work to lighten other burdens." Their relationship matured in ways neither had predicted. They spoke honestly about the cost of rumors, about the ways grief had been weaponized in both directions, and about how small acts of attention can change a life more than grand declarations. They learned to be present with one another without the old defenses of blame. Victoria's fall from favor did not make Maya relish the outcome. She understood the dangerous peace that comes from delighting in someone's humiliation. Instead, she felt a pragmatic relief. The evening had altered certain social expectations, and consequences had been delivered in proportion to the harm. Victoria, confronted with the reality of her actions, retreated for a time into reflection. Some of her circle abandoned her in public, but reached out privately seeking advice on how to rebuild without repeating the same cruelty. That, in Maya's view, was preferable to spectacle. Consequences that invite learning are better than punishments that only satisfy the crowd. In the months that followed, the city whispered different kinds of stories. People told less about the moment and more about the results. A chain of small restaurants that survived a lease crisis because of partnership. A culinary scholarship named after a man who had been quietly generous in life. A series of workshops for service workers on financial education and respect in the workplace. The cream envelope remained a small artifact of an earlier cruelty, but it no longer defined Maya's life. It had been, paradoxically, the pressure that unlatched the box she had carried for 15 years and allowed the truth to get out. There was a quiet scene one afternoon that illustrated the story's long arc. Maya walked into a small community kitchen she had helped fund. Students were learning to julienne and to negotiate the language of a workplace. One of them, a young man with the same steady eyes Maya recognized in many of the people she served, approached with the careful courage of someone who had rehearsed a question. "Do you ever feel like you weren't meant to be seen?" he asked. Maya considered the question and then sat down beside him. "I did," she said, the answer brief but layered. "For a long time. But then I learned that being seen doesn't mean being taken. It means you get to choose how you show up. You get to build yourself in front of people who will hold you with respect. That's the difference." He nodded, and there was a small human exchange that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with human economies of care. At a more formal level, Maya was asked to speak at a local conference about dignity in the workplace. The organizers wanted a story that resonated beyond the city, a narrative that other leaders could take seriously. She distilled what she had learned into 6 short lessons, each anchored in the life she had rebuilt. First, never let someone else's rumor define your truth. She had let a simpler, angrier story guide her for 15 years before choosing to seek facts. The facts did not erase pain, but they cleared the way for honest conversation. Second, power can be used for protection or for humiliation. Choose protection. People in positions of influence are stewards. Their decisions ripple outward. Third, forgiveness is a path to freedom, not a ticket that cancels accountability. Maya had forgiven her mother, but that forgiveness was paired with the insistence that actions be matched to words. Fourth, dignity is practical work. It is in how you treat service workers, how you design policies, how you fund alternatives to exploitative systems. Fifth, do not make other people's redemption your entertainment. There is no moral virtue in watching someone rise if the rise is only staged for your applause. Sixth, it is never too late to step into your life. Maya had been 45 before she allowed herself to call the person she had been most afraid to face. She turned a sealed box into an opening. She spoke each point calmly, without the urgency of a sermon, and with the gravity of someone who had taken the long route through her own story. The audience listened not because the narrative had scandal, but because it had work, and because the speaker had insisted upon both consequence and mercy. Afterward, people came to speak to her not to touch the scars of the past but to ask practical questions. How to set up partnerships, how to design respectful workplaces, how to make forgiveness real without letting it be a cover for inaction. She answered as she always had, with a blend of gentleness and relentless attention to details that mattered. In private, she and Catherine sometimes looked back at the drawer they had once placed certain letters in. They did not fetishize suffering, nor did they deny it. They acknowledged that the truth had been hard, but had become the ground on which a different life could be built. The reconciliation was not a neat bow, but a daily practice. Conversations that were frank, apologies offered when needed, and an acceptance that both had faults to own. Years later, Maya would walk into a meeting at Thompson Global and find colleagues listening to her because they had seen the work she did. She was not a novelty, she was a builder. Her hands, once stained with the small burns of kitchen life, now gestured as she shaped programs that mattered. The old invisibility had been exchanged for a visible insistence on fairness. There were small private moments of triumph that sustained her. The young server who had winked at her in the Sterling came to work for one of the pilot restaurants. A former regular at La Tau Noir became a donor to a scholarship named in memory of Maya's father, who had been quietly generous in life. Catherine, who had once been a figure both feared and admired, learned to celebrate not for the optics of success, but for the slow tasks of reconciliation and repair. Maya never forgot the morning she found the cream envelope on her tray at the Sterling. She kept it for a while in a small box on her desk, a relic of a moment when cruelty was disguised as entertainment. On the day she retired the envelope, she folded it carefully and placed it under the box that held her father's letters. Not out of sentimentality, but as a way of acknowledging a circuit closed. Humiliation had been turned into witness. Rumor had been turned into fact. Absence had been turned into a reconnection that worked. Her final public remarks in a small civic auditorium were short and to the point. She told the audience about small economies, of food, of respect, of the gestures that keep a community human. She ended with a simple invitation. "We are often hiding parts of ourselves because we fear being seen," she said. What if instead we asked, "Who are you hiding from? What are you hiding? And who will you call to help you step into the light?" There is work to do, and it begins when we stop using people as props and start seeing them as partners. The audience rose, not in applause for theater, but in the small, deliberate approval of people who had been taught a possibility. She stepped down from the stage, and a woman in the front row, not a famous philanthropist, not a socialite, but a neighbor, came forward and took her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "You helped me see my own mother differently." Maya smiled, and in that smile there was the quiet of a person who had repaired many of the small tugs of loosed threads that make a life wearable again. She had not sought revenge. She had sought truth. She had found reconciliation. She had found a role that asked her to be steady. As the years settled, the city carried new stories. People who had once found humor in the diminishment of others learned slowly the expense of such amusements. Those who had once argued that certain people were ornaments now had to reckon with what it takes to be a neighbor. The cream envelope remained a cautionary object, a small artifact of how easily people can be used, and a reminder that sometimes the very thing intended to wound can, if met with courage, begin a restoration. The last time Maya walked into the Sterling as a guest rather than a server, she sat at a table with people who had once been strangers and now were colleagues and friends. No one offered her pity. No one turned her into a story for the evening. They shared food and conversation, and when someone asked about her father, she spoke with the ease of someone who had reconciled a past that had once been full of rumor. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, small decisions continued to bend the arc of lives. Catherine and Maya remained, imperfect and steady, sketching in the daily lines of a relationship rebuilt. Victoria moved on to a quieter existence, one that forced reflection without spectacle. James found his own path through the lessons he had been taught that night in La Tau Noir. When Maya thought of the exact moment that swung everything, the cream envelope on the table, the small public attempt at humiliation, she did not let the memory curdle into revenge. Instead, she kept it as evidence that small cruelties can be resisted with quiet dignity, that facts have power, that forgiveness is a practice and not a performance. She would tell younger people what she had learned. Be tenacious about truth. Do not accept a cheap narrative when facts are available. Insist on dignity in the places you serve and the places you lead. And if you are fortunate enough to have a person with resources at your back, ask them to use their power to protect, not to perform. The city would continue to make and remake stories. This one, the one that began with an invitation meant to humiliate and ended with a woman reclaiming a life, did not become a showpiece. It became, instead, an argument for how we treat one another, quietly persistent and oddly persuasive. Who are you hiding from? What have you carried in a box for longer than you should have? If there is one thing this story asks, it is that you answer those questions honestly. Step toward the people who have the courage to listen. Take whatever offers of help are made with humility and insist upon integrity. And remember that forgiveness requires accountability, and accountability can be an offering, not only a punishment. Share a moment when you stopped hiding, or a person who helped you step into the light.